Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Bible Basics with Pastor Steve. And we're doing Wisdom Basics this month. Hello, Stella. Good to have you here this evening. I said this month, but really, I guess next week will be in September, and we're not quite done with wisdom yet. So tonight, our fourth week in wisdom, and we're going to be talking about Proverbs for the last time. And there are many Proverbs we have not covered. I encourage you to read the whole book sometime. It's a lot of fun to read in one of the contemporary translations. So take a look at the contemporary English version is my favorite for Proverbs and for most things. If you're looking at the easier to read modern translations. We're doing one Bible story at a time. Well, we're not technically in stories right now, but we're doing one section of the Bible at a time each week. And I send the stuff out on Tuesday afternoon to remind everybody to tune in. That way you can read in advance. And if you don't have a copy yet, you can email me at the email address on your screen, and I will put you on the mailing list. Charles, good to have you here. Welcome. All right, we're going to go ahead and open with a word of prayer. Hello, Roseanne. And then we're going to go ahead and dive in tonight, all right? And Cindy Brown, good to have you here. Let's pray. Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you alone are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Hopefully you had a chance to look at the Proverbs that I sent you. Once again, these are not even a paraphrasing. These are a complete retelling. And one of them is sort of, I took more liberty with one of them than some of the others. See if you can guess which one. Proverbs 5:18 says, "May your life be blessed and may you enjoy a long marriage." Chapter 13, verse 1 says, "Wise children accept discipline, but foolish children mock their parents." 13:24 says, "If you spare the rod, you hate your children, but if you love them, you discipline them." 15:17 says, "A salad eaten with people you love is better than a steak eaten with people you hate." 22:6 says, "If you teach them right when they're young, they'll do right when they're old." And 23:13 says, "Don't be afraid to punish your children. If you beat them with a stick, it won't kill them." And 30, my computer is acting up. Sorry about that. Last but not least, Proverbs 31, chapter 31, verses 28 through 30. "Her children respect her, and her husband praises her. Many women are good, but you're great. Charm is manipulative, and beauty fades, but a God-fearing woman should be praised." All right. So who else joined us? Barbara, good evening. Mandy, good evening. All right. So one of those Proverbs I took more liberties with. Can anybody guess which one it was? Any of them jump out at you and think, oh, he must have messed around with that one quite a bit? I'll hold off on telling you which one it was. See if any of you can guess. So for Proverbs, we're asking a slightly different question. Ordinarily, each week we ask the questions, what does this story tell us about God? What does it tell us about ourselves? What does it tell us about our relationship with God? With Proverbs, I'm generally cutting straight to the question, what does this tell us about our relationship with God and with each other? Salad and steak. Any other guesses? Tonight's theme is wisdom and the family, okay? And there's a bunch of Proverbs about a bunch of different things that you could consider to be family or not family, depending on how you look at it. Hello, Jennifer. So let's first talk about how to discipline children. There are multiple Proverbs about disciplining children, and they all advocate discipline. And the question is, do they advocate corporal punishment, or do they just assume corporal punishment? And there was a book written about this. I remember back when my kids were little, we were reading books about parenting, and some of them were Christian books. And one of the books that Becky read, I didn't read it. It made the claim that the Christian parents must beat their children because God's law demands it. It kind of indicated that it didn't even matter whether it worked or not. God said to do it, so you do it. Well, that's generally stuff from Proverbs that people are quoting when they say that. The instance, there are a couple of laws that talk about disciplining children. They're related to capital punishment, though, not corporal punishment. When is a parent allowed to kill their own kid? And there are two scenarios, but these are both from very early times when Israel was nomadic, and there were no jails or police or anything like that, so penalties tended to be tougher when you had a hard time enforcing things. So wisdom is not law. Proverbs don't demand that you do anything. They tell you what's a good idea, what's a bad idea, what works, what doesn't, what's wise, what's foolish. It's all very values based, but it's not law. It's not a code. It's not something that's enforceable. It's just telling you, if you do this, it's going to go well for you. If you do this, it's not going to go bad for you. So does it instruct us to use corporal punishment, or does it just assume that people do when they discipline their children? And I lean toward the latter for a very simple reason. If you were to look for a story in the Bible, and I did today, is there a story in the Bible where somebody beat their kid for misbehavior? And I can't find one. Okay, if you find one, let me know. Okay, because I wasn't able to. So discipline was much more corporal in the past than it is now. And certainly Proverbs wants us to discipline our children, but I think you'd have a hard time making an argument that Proverbs is, hello, Barbara, and hello, Debbie. I think you'd have a hard time arguing that Proverbs is instructing us to use corporal punishment. It seems to me clear that it's just assuming that when you discipline your kids, that's how you're going to do it. Not everybody does discipline their kids. And I remember in seminary, when we were talking about this, Dr. Birch, my Old Testament professor, said that the Bible talks about two different concepts. One is that, which is more closely related to wisdom, which is that if you do the wrong thing, there will be consequences that are sort of natural consequences, and you will learn from those. And that's kind of cosmic discipline, right? Cosmic justice, divine justice. But it also says that parents are supposed to discipline their children, which is different from just letting consequences play out. He says, so for example, if my kid doesn't study for exam and then they flunk the exam, the bad grade is the natural consequence for not studying. And he said, but the kid, when they come home and they tell me that they got a bad grade because they didn't study, he says, I'm going to punish them on top of that to speed up the learning process. And both of these are discussed in the Bible. And wisdom generally talks about natural consequences, but it's saying that we should also discipline as well to help the kids learn faster. I remember when we were talking about this in seminary, there was a person, and I felt for her because it was clear she was speaking from some very painful personal experience, but she could not believe that people of faith believed that it was ethical to discipline their children, that they should just let the children learn from the natural consequences of their own mistakes, that we should not discipline them. And she didn't care whether it was corporal punishment or not. She didn't believe that children should ever be punished for any reason. Well, Proverbs says that that's child abuse. If you don't discipline your children and you only let them learn from their own mistakes, that's actually setting your children up to fail. Now, there are secular proverbs about wisdom, right? Or about discipline. There's lots of studies about how you should or shouldn't parent your children or discipline your children. And there's pretty good consensus, has been for a very long time. And I'm not talking about the issue of corporal punishment. I'm talking about just discipline in general. Well, I would go further to say that this isn't just good for disciplining children. This is good just for organizational leadership in general, that there need to be rules. Everybody needs to understand the rules. If there are going to be consequences for breaking the rules, those consequences have to be clear. People who break consequences should be able to tell you themselves what the consequences are going to be. They shouldn't say, "Oh, I don't know what's going to happen to me because I did this. This is, it should be very predictable. It should be very consistent. So the consequences have to be consistent, and it must be clear to the person being disciplined why the discipline is taking place. In the case of children, the children have to understand that this is being done for their benefit. That this is not being done for the parents' benefit. It's being done for and that's an important thing, because there are children who would tell you that I don't think my parent is really disciplining me because they think it's for my own good. I think they're doing it because it makes them feel better. And there are adults who would look back and say that was the case in their experiences. Let's see what Cindy says here. In my experience, these spare the rod proverbs were referred to by Christians as justification for physical abuse. Yeah, well, in some cases, absolutely true. I'll pull back around to that in a minute. So if the kid is going to believe that it's in their own best interest, that means that punishments cannot be made in anger, and they cannot be made arbitrarily. The kids should never have reason to believe that the punishment is actually about the parents just venting their emotion. I've known parents who would say that they were very good at disciplining their children when I knew for a fact that their version of discipline was trashing the kid's room in a drunken rage because they did something wrong. I knew kids growing up who they knew what the rules were, but they had no clue what the consequences were going to be, because the consequences varied from one day to the next depending on the kind of mood the parent was in. There were days when they could break a rule that they would have thought would have been a very serious rule, and the parents would just kind of blow it off because they were in a great mood. Nah, it's fine. There are other days when just doing anything that sort of made the parents snap, and you didn't know what was going to happen. I remember hanging out one of those kids I hung out with quite a bit, and I remember one day there was a large gathering at his house. It was actually a Christian fellowship group, and the kid said something that the dad didn't like, and the dad got this look in his eyes, and we cleared out of there like a tornado had just struck, because we knew that one was about to strike and something bad was about to happen. That's no good. And I remember watching a resource, I think it was a Bluefish TV resource, where a parent was talking about discipline and how he knew a family growing up that took pride in the arbitrary nature of the discipline in their house. The dad would say, "We shoot from the hip in our house. The kids always stay in line because they know that if they step out of line, anything could happen. They have no idea. They have no idea how we're going to react. So they don't ever step out of line." And he was saying that his son was dating the girl from this family, and the girl was half an hour late getting back from curfew one night. It wasn't the son's fault. He wasn't with her. She was out with friends, and they said, "Well, you're not going to prom." Just like that, a week before prom, just didn't even think about it. Just boom, half an hour late, not going to prom. She had already bought the dress. Her date had already rented his tuxedo, had already rented the limousine and everything, and he was in the situation. So what do? Do I go without her? And he ended up not going. And Discipline should never deprive a kid of a critical rite of passage. All right, so how does that relate to corporal punishment? Let me tell you the approach that we had initially. We believed that it was a good idea to use corporal punishment on children that were too young to be reasoned with when they did things that were potentially dangerous. So in other words, if a kid did something that could have gotten them killed or maimed, and they were too young to really understand why it was so dangerous, we wanted them to associate that thing with pain. So for example, the classic example is if we saw the kid reaching for a hot stove or a fireplace or something hot, let them know that their hand is going to hurt if it gets too close to that. That seemed logical. It still seems logical to me to do that. I don't consider that to be abusive. The problem is, I caught myself breaking that rule once. One day I spanked one of the kids for doing something that was not potentially dangerous because I was angry. And that was when we changed the rule to no corporal punishment at all. Because, if you're gotta be able to trust yourself, if you're gonna have the nuclear option, you got to be able to trust yourself with the nuclear option. And I used to say it's the threat of nuclear, it's the nuclear deterrent, right? You have to at least tell the kids that you believe in corporal punishment, so they believe it's a possibility, whether it's actually a possibility or not. Oh, geez, I was so young and foolish in those days. I don't think I would do things the same if I were going to do them over again. The good news is the kid that I spanked does not remember being spanked, but I remember. Anyway, so one of those proverbs, of course, said, I was thinking people might think that this was one that I had messed with. It is not. Don't be afraid to punish your children. If you beat them with a stick, it won't kill them. That's pretty much what it says. And the steak and the salad, I switched it from vegetables or greens to salad. I switched it from a feast to steak just to make it more like an everyday choice for us. But that's the gist of what it said. It said vegetables or leaves eaten in peace and quiet, or with people eaten with people you love is better than different translations say eaten in peace or eaten with people you love versus eating with somebody that you can't stand or eaten in anger. So no, I did not mess with that one. The one that I messed with was the one that had to do with a long marriage, because I was trying to how you paraphrase that depends on how you interpret what they were saying. The original is enjoy the wife of your youth, or the woman you married when you were young. And may your life be blessed, and may you enjoy the wife you married when you were young. And so the question is it saying that we hope you have a nice long marriage? Or is it saying don't trade in your original wife for a younger model or a newer model? And you could argue it could be both. Okay. So I went with the long marriage. I might have been wrong on that. All right. Meal times, whether you've got kids or adults in the house, meal times, therefore, should be peaceful, not stressful. And I know that in some families, meals are the things that you remember the best about growing up, and even as an adult, meals that you shared at special occasions. Those are the times that you remember. But there are other people who have awful memories of meals, leading to indigestion every night because, stressful silence or never knowing if an argument was going to break out, food gets thrown. So you want mealtime to be a special time. In the Bible, meals are sacred, right? The sacrificial meals are sacred. The meals Jesus had with his followers are sacred. Jesus did his best work over meals. You want to strive to make your family meals peaceful, sacred moments. All right. So the last chunk that I gave you was just a snippet from Proverbs 31, which is sometimes called Ode to a Good Wife. And of course, in the modern world where spousal roles have changed and gender roles have changed, you could just say Ode to a Good Spouse. And it's talking about the things that you should value in a spouse, and they're all, virtues. They're not supernatural. They're not supernatural. They're not superficial things, right? You don't want somebody just because they're charming, because charming is by definition a show that they're putting on to win favor. You don't want people just because their beauty is nice, but going to last, right? Beauty fades over time. All of our beauties have faded over time. And so that's not, you want the virtues that will last, the things that are much deeper than skin deep. So all of this stuff together, then, what does this tell us about our relationship with God and with each other? Because there are some people who would read this and say, well, this tells us that God values marriage, that God values procreation, that God wants us to get married and to have kids and to do certain things. I'm not going to go that route, because there are people in the Bible who do neither of those things, like Jesus and a couple other important people. And they're never depicted as being less than whole or less than complete or a failure because they didn't marry and have kids. Now, I know there have been times in our society where you were viewed as a failure if you didn't get married, if you didn't have kids. And it's really sad. There are people in they're past now, but there were people in my family who never married, never had kids, and were belittled by their parents until their parents died, because you can't do anything right. That's why you never got married. That's just awful. That not everybody gets a spouse. There aren't enough to go around. Sometimes there's too many men, sometimes there's too many women, but there's never the exact right number. I don't believe that God does require us to get married. I don't believe that God requires us to have children, not by any stretch. Now, these proverbs are written with the understanding that most people do get married and most people do have children. So if you're going to get married and have children, you should do it the right way. That's what these proverbs are for. And of course, once again, the proverbs are written for parents to use to teach their children right from wrong. So just the fact that you're reading the proverbs kind of assumes that you've got a kid on your lap and you're trying to pass some wisdom on to it. All right. That's it for Proverbs tonight. Next week, we're going to talk about Ecclesiastes. So once again, Proverbs all say in one way or another, the righteous shall prosper, but the wicked shall perish. Well, Ecclesiastes is going to be a wise man, probably Solomon, looking back on his life and saying, well, I know that's what we say, but is that really true? And I tried all through my life, to be wise, and I'm looking back now and I'm questioning how well that worked out. Okay. So it's a absolutely critical addition to our understanding of wisdom. All right, so anything interesting going on in the Methodist world this week? I'm going to say there was. There's an interesting article on Insight written by Jack Shitama, who happens to live in Maryland. He's a Methodist pastor. He's active here. He works at a camping and retreat center right now. He's also an author. He writes about non-anxious leadership. A lot of people have read his stuff. It's good stuff. And he wrote an article on the importance of life cycle ceremonies. And he did it because his son just got married, and he's, I guess, sort of in the afterglow of his kid's wedding and thinking and reflecting theologically. And he says some stuff that I think is kind of important because, you know, we're losing our sense of ritual in our culture. A lot of the institutions that used to conduct rituals are struggling. A lot of rituals that used to be important don't seem to be as important to people anymore. And the wedding, a lot of weddings these days are very small affairs. They're destination weddings, so only a few people are there. It's not the family event that it once was. And I'm not trying to criticize people who do that, but I do want to be sure that we understand what we're losing when we lose these things. And he was talking about the importance of, they evolved for a reason. Life cycle ceremonies are important. Rites of passage, graduation, marriage, funerals, baptism. It's important for families to get together and to celebrate, especially when they're celebrating an accomplishment. When the kid gets the diploma, everybody should come together and congratulate them. When the kids get married, people should get together and wish them their best. And yes, when somebody dies, people need to rally around the family. And I'll tell you, one of the saddest things that I ever saw, I went to a funeral where it wasn't exactly a funeral. The family wasn't particularly religious. They wanted to have an opportunity for people to come to a viewing and maybe say a few words. They wanted everybody to get some kind of closure, but they weren't a religious family. They didn't want a clergy person there. I went just because I knew them and I wanted to be supportive. I didn't try to insert myself into the situation in any way. So all these people are gathered in this room, and the casket is there. It's open for people to view the deceased. And it was a young person, somebody who died too young, much younger than I am now. And the family was there, and the person who organized everything at some point realized, hello, Sandy, somebody needs to say something because everybody's here just looking at each other, and there's this awkward silence, and we wanted to get together and support each other, but how do we do that without a structure? And he stood up and he said, I guess somebody should say something. I didn't really plan anything. And he sort of tried to wing it, and he wasn't really happy with the way he was doing it. It was sad. Everybody knew they needed something. They came thinking they didn't, but once they got there, they realized they did. And because every life rite of passage is, many of them are joyful, but all of them have an element of grief. Obviously, funeral is about grieving a loss. So is a graduation. Kids not in school anymore. I've seen parents cry at graduations because they know that, well, this is my last kid and they're not going to be in school anymore. I'm not going to be at the band booster thing anymore. And they're not going to be hanging out in the living room with their friends anymore. And this time of our life has just ended. And I don't know what this next section is going to be about. So there's a grief element to that. There's a grief element in all of them. So all of these rites of passage are very important because people need support in their grief and they need affirmation in their victory. But he also points out that there's more to it than that. And this is the part I just said. I think we know intuitively, at least subconsciously at some level. But it's also important to point out that these major life transitions, when there's a birth, when there's a death, when there's a graduation, when there's a wedding, any of the major rites of passage, when the kid gets the keys to their first car, we need to make more of a big deal out of that, okay? Because if you don't know how important those keys are to somebody, where do you try and take them away from somebody? Then you realize that the rite to passage into adulthood is when you gain your mobility and you get the keys to that car and you can go anywhere you want. And when you lose that ability, you've just made a very big transition. When the doctor tells the MVA that you shouldn't be driving anymore, that is a major transition. Both of those events need to be handled by a society, and they're not. They're ignored. We just sort of pat them on the back and say everything's going to be fine when they lose their keys, and we tell them, don't you go out there and do something stupid when they get their keys. There need to be rituals around these, and we've never developed rituals. It used to be that the men and women both had rites of passage into adulthood, and we don't really have that in our culture anymore. And it should be based around those keys, because subconsciously, anyway, all of these transition points, Jack Shitama is saying, these are major changes in people's lives. Changes are coming to people's lives, whether they like it or not. Changes are going to happen. Their daily routine is going to change. The setting might change. These are these times in people's lives when they're going to go through lifestyle changes are the time when people are most open to making big lifestyle changes that might benefit them in tremendously positive ways, which is why they need to be managed, which is why family elders, family leaders need to be wise and understand that with this transition, I need to be present and I need to help them make the changes that they need to make to move into the next stage of life. And he would add that a pastor can help with that too. And likewise in the later stages in life, when it's time to sell the house or time to stop driving the car, that's a major change in lifestyle. But that can also be a time when people make changes that are going to improve their life going forward, if we're conscious about it and guide people through that. And that's wisdom. That's values-based. All right, that's everything that I had for you tonight. Jack Shitama, once again, is the name. He wrote a book. He wrote books on non-anxious leadership. I don't remember the title off the top of my head, but if you're interested in that, take a look at it. Rob, enjoyed tonight's wisdom and rite of passage discussion. Well, thank you. I saw Zoe and Jordan yesterday, and I was talking about how I had just seen you guys earlier this summer and talking about the Christmas party and everything. Yeah. They're good kids, aren't they? I think they are. Anyway, all right. That's enough of that. Don't forget to email me any questions you have, especially about Ecclesiastes. And, and the part of Ecclesiastes everybody remembers, I think I already mentioned this, is the wrong part. At least they a small world, yeah. The part from the song by the Byrds, and they know that part and they think it's a very comforting thing. But if you read the entire chapter, you realize that it was not meant to be comforting at all. Read the entire chapter. It's early on in Ecclesiastes. A time for every purpose under heaven. Read it in one of the standard translations and tell me what you think they're actually saying. All right, we're going to go ahead and close with a word of prayer. God, give me the grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, the courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. Excuse me. Great to talk to you guys tonight. Thank you for being active in the chat. See you guys soon, either online